All right. Thank you. We're live. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. We're here live on Monday at 1 p.m. Central Time, as always. My name is Marie. I'm an executive functioning coach, and I'm joined by Brandon Tessers, who's a therapist with Effective Artistry. Effective Artistry is a neurodiversity affirming therapy practice based in Northbrook, Illinois. And the therapists at the practice are licensed to work with anyone in the state of Illinois. And the coaches, myself and Sarah, are able to work with you wherever you are in the world. This show is just an open conversation. It's a chance for you to put questions to Brandon. I can ask them on your behalf if you pop them in the chat. So usually we have a topic, and we try to have a topic. I didn't get any questions from our audience to put to Brandon this week, so we'll probably just brainstorm a little bit. But if you join us in the chat and you've got any questions, we will take the conversation wherever you'd like it to go. So this is not therapy, as you say, Brandon, for oh so very many reasons. But it is a chance to ask questions of a therapist. So if you're curious about therapy or executive functioning coaching or neurodiversity, and you'd like to learn more, maybe you don't have access to a coach or therapist at the moment, this is an opportunity for you to ask questions that you'd like to have answered. So if you're here in the chat, let us know. Thank you for joining us. How are you, Brendan?
I am all right. Hard to say whether I'm tired or in a bad mood or whether they're even separate things or what, but I'm all right. I'm happy to be here. I'm excited for the stream.
All right.
How are you?
So have you had a busy day then?
Somewhat. Just the morning went differently than I anticipated. It was different than our usual morning. Things were off, and I haven't been able to talk as much to anyone thus far today as I usually am. Especially for me, when something is presented to me, when I become aware of something that's different than I would want it to be, a problem, and don't have the ability to engage in trying to solve that or talking through that or whatever, get stuck in that stuff. But honestly, also it might generally I think it's very difficult for anyone to distinguish between tiredness or depletion of some kind or another and negative emotional states. Like how to say what's one and what's the other is tricky for sure.
Yeah, and tiredness has such an impact on everything else. It magnifies a bad mood or magnifies a low mood because I guess your defenses are down when you're not sleeping well.
Sure. Well, and I mean, certainly there are, well, I say certainly, hypothetically, I suppose, there are things where it's like something happens and it really bothers you, you get pissed about it or irritated or very sad or whatever, where hypothetically had that same thing happen. Like there have been other times where something same or similar to that happened when you weren't as tired or you weren't as hungry or you weren't as overwhelmed with other things and it didn't impact you in the same way. That when something makes you angry, it's not irrational no matter what state you're in. Like whatever the thing is something that your reaction to it would be anger. But the more you're struggling in other ways, the more likely you are to respond to it in that way. Whereas the better you're doing, the more likely you are to just be focused on other things or register it and be annoyed by it and then move on to other things or whatever.
Yeah. There's a little bit of interference audio coming from your end. It sounds like you're underwater at times.
I got in order to try to help make sure that I'm drinking water more throughout the day because I have a hard time with that. I got as a Christmas gift, an electric tea kettle for my office.
Ah.
It has a keep warm thing in it. So I just turned it off. Is it better? Sound better?
A little bit better, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, that's what it was.
Yeah, sleep is something I think we've talked about a bit. And it's something that I definitely have challenges with. Um, and I had a really bad day last week, and it's just because I haven't been sleeping well, and everything seemed impossible. And then last night not last night, the night before last, I got a good night's sleep, and everything seemed totally doable yesterday.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, sleep is not the only factor, but definitely the most impactful factor with all of this.
Yeah.
And yeah, how, like, whenever I'm saying tired or depleted or exhausted, in my head, it's more complicated than just a simple binary, like one metric of exhausted to energized. There's a lot
Yeah.
of different possibilities, but even simplifying it to that, just a simple like one scale of how energized to how exhausted. Yeah, the more exhausted you are, honestly, a lot of what we would in therapy speak, what we would refer to as passive suicidal ideation, which is when people are thinking or feeling, it'd be great if I just didn't wake up tomorrow, like I wish I didn't exist, no active intention to actually do something in order to kill themselves, but just this desire of like, man, it would be nice if I didn't live anymore. That it's hard to say that at least a very large percentage of when people are experiencing that's exhaustion.
Yeah.
I mean, literally, I don't want to wake up tomorrow is one of the most common ways people will phrase that sense. And that's not too different from just, I don't want to wake up, I want to rest. Like, I don't want to do anything. Even the things that I enjoy doing, I don't want to do. Like, no matter, I can't get out of bed. No matter how much I sleep, I still feel tired. All these things that we associate with severe depression. Tiredness, even on that simple, like oversimplified, just one scale, is a big deal, a much bigger deal than I think people tend to recognize, especially people who identify as neurodivergent. Because if you identify as neurodivergent, then you obviously you find value in psychological and neurological concepts, right? Like explaining experiences and behaviors, at least in part through psychology.
Yeah.
And when that's the case, you tend to focus more on how you're thinking about something or what's wrong, or like you're trying to solve problems cognitively. So even when you're exhausted, I guess for people who are not as versed in psychological concepts, that when they're really angry at something and somebody else were to suggest something like, have you eaten any food? Maybe you're just angry or whatever. It seems to me that it is more likely that a person who doesn't have a bunch of psychological terminology and like justification for the things that they think and feel and do would be more likely to say, maybe you're right and I'll eat something. Where those of us who are very invested in explaining and justifying everything in cognitive, intellectual, psychological terms, if someone were to suggest that, it's more likely that we'll respond with like, no, that's not it. I am upset because, et cetera, et cetera. And anyone could do either one, but.
So do you think it would be helpful for people who identify as neurodivergent to drop some of that language? Drop, I don't know if that's the right word, but to let go of some of that.
Well, I certainly, and we've done a lot on this in recent weeks, I certainly encourage people to not feel as though they need to justify and explain everything that they're thinking and feeling and doing. Because dropping that language serves a purpose, or people have acquired it. Telling them not to use that language is like saying, go backwards to feeling worse than before you started thinking of it that way.
Yeah.
And I would rather encourage them to move forward of like, okay, you felt bad about thinking or feeling or behaving in that way. Then you got some like intellectual, psychological justifications and explanations, which made you feel not as bad. You still don't like thinking or feeling, behaving that way, but now you don't feel as bad about it. Then we want to move even further forward of saying, yeah, you don't need to be able to explain and justify it in order to not feel bad about it. You can just not feel bad about it, which is, I think, a shocking concept to. And a lot of this stuff, I honestly don't know if it's universal and just more intense or put into language more with people who identify as neurodivergent, or if there are some people who don't. I don't know that there's such a person that like never feels like they're being irrational or like they need to explain or justify why they're feeling or doing. You know, I think everyone does it to some extent in certain contexts or whatever. Neurodivergent people who identify as neurodivergent definitely do it a lot more, or they wouldn't have the language of neurodiversity to even use. You don't find that language, you don't think it through and apply it to yourself unless you're going through a process of trying to figure out what's going on with you.
Yeah. So part of the process then of learning to get in touch with your emotions is learning to get in touch with your body, right?
I mean, so this is Brandon speak, right? Like, I don't know. I'm sure other people agree with it and say similar things, but I don't know who does or doesn't. To me, emotion, anything that we're calling an emotion, is something which has both physical sensation and cognitive observations, experiences, right? That if I'm feeling that, for me, if I'm feeling that, like that sense here where it's like a mix between there's an empty spot, but also an over full spot right here at the base of my sternum where it's like expanding, but also empty. And it just can't be explained, but it is definitely a physical, whatever it is, I'm perceiving it as a physical sensation.
Yeah.
If I just feel that, and in my thoughts, I'm not thinking anything in particular, then I'm probably going to say like, what is that, heartburn, or like, what's going on with me? I'll think of it as a physical thing. Whereas if I'm experiencing that and also am about to go on stage and give a big presentation I'm nervous about, then I'll say, okay, that's nerves. Or if I'm feeling that after my first date with my wife, you know, and I'm super excited, then I'm like, oh, that's excitement.
Yeah.
Right? Then I have to pair the two things. And if I'm just thinking without any physical sensation, then I just call those thoughts. So yes, to me, emotion involves always both some physical sensations, whatever they actually are, they're perceived that way, and some cognition to go along with it. So being more aware of your body would help you to be more aware of your emotional state. Yeah.
We talked about interoception a bit before, but maybe it'd be worth going over it again then.
Sure.
Like, so we've talked about low interoception and how people who identify. Pardon?
I call it deprioritized interoception.
Oh, okay. I like that actually. Yeah. Rather
just
than
broad language.
Low sounds again like a deficit.
Right. It makes it sound like you have less of an ability to detect it rather than pattern of detecting it less. I think something that gets overlooked in talk about sensory issues and sensitivities is that there's hypersensitivity, which is what people are generally talking about, where you're more sensitive to data than seems like is helpful. Mm-hmm. There's also hyposensitivity, which means you are less sensitive to a certain type of data than seems like would be helpful. If you, like me, are someone that like, you just don't smell stuff, and then people are like, don't you smell that? That's an olfactory hyposensitivity. So what we're talking about in that language is actually an interoceptive hyposensitivity. You notice interoceptive data at a lower rate than seems like would be optimally useful. And so, yes, theoretically, your attentional process is the things which rank order, like what's worth noting, right? What's most worth noticing on down. For whatever reason, seem to keep shunting interoceptive data down that list, which goes along with what we're saying, right? That if you're upset and you think about all the thoughts and the things that have happened that you're upset about, and don't think about whether or not your physiological state might be impacting that sense, then yeah, like that's what we're talking about. You have reason to think that it's a problem that can be analyzed and addressed and solved without that information, so it's not very important to get that information.
So how do you switch that up? How do you become more aware of your physical and emotional state? And if you're deprioritizing those sensations.
Well, I think it's a difficult process. And I should say, I think as a baseline in our modern day, the baseline, I think everybody has a interoceptive hyposensitivity, that pretty much everybody notices that data less than would theoretically be the optimal amount.
Is that because of the nature of how we live now?
I would think so, yeah.
Yeah, because
I don't talk. Okay.
Oh, sorry, because like we're more geared towards intellectual work than probably we have been as a species in the past.
Well, definitely. And conversely, way less of our resources go toward anything of a physical nature than in our species past, right? That when you eat and how much you eat is based a lot more around thoughts about when is the right time to eat and what's the right thing and what's the right amount than it is actually based on eating when you're hungry and stopping when you're no longer hungry. When you use the bathroom is based around thoughts about when would be, we all, for the most, vast majority of us in our cultures go to these schools starting at age 5 at the latest, where you raise your hand and ask to go to the bathroom, and sometimes they say no. Or ask to get some water and they say no. Or vice versa, it's bathroom break time and you don't feel like you need to and you just are told to do it anyway. And there's nothing wrong, like nobody's doing anything wrong with that, right? Like I have my children use the bathroom before they go to sleep. My 4-year-old, that I have him use the bathroom even if he doesn't feel like he needs to. There's reasons that we have, kids use the bathroom before getting in a road trip, or we ourselves do it, or before going to watch a movie that we don't want, all of this makes sense. Nobody's doing anything wrong, but it does mean that the process is, why bother noticing a physically uncomfortable sensation of needing to use the restroom if it doesn't impact whether you're going to use the restroom or not? It's just useless data that is taking up space. Better to think about and pay attention to other things. So everybody, I think, has been trained not to pay much attention to that. And it's not just about school and parents. It's, 3 square meals a day. It's not historically how our species ate, right? Like we eat different things and at different times and different amounts than our evolutionary ancestors. So training yourself to become more aware of that stuff is a big process. And fortunately, there's a lot out there of different ways that help people to do that. And we're talking about mindfulness. A lot of what would fall under the category of mindfulness is about getting better at observing your own state of being, both cognitively and physically. We're talking about yoga and various different diet practices and physical activity practices. Even trauma work has a lot to do with, the body keeps the score, right? Like a lot of what trauma work is to people is people who are cognitively oriented and think of everything in those terms. And then it's reminding them like, hey, your body has a role to play in all this too. Let's check in with your body and see where you're doing. Somatic work, EMDR, many different ways for people to approach becoming more in touch with their body, which in our culture seems to happen, just trends wise, seems to happen in when you're in your 30s is the most common time. It seems to me that people are all of a sudden like, I should start trying to pay more attention to my body that I haven't been my whole life, which doesn't bother you as much when you're 21. And then all of a sudden things start happening as you age. And you're like, there's something that's worth paying attention to.
Yeah.
It takes a long time. And it's very unpleasant.
Yeah. We take it for granted when things are running smoothly.
Right. Well, and as you pay more attention, I use this metaphor with people of like, imagine that you have this giant mansion of a house with 30 rooms in it, but you're one person. You don't need all that space. So you just live in your bedroom and use that one bathroom and kitchen and common area. And rather than spend all of your time and energy and resources you don't have available keeping everything pristine, and like the rest of it just gets ignored and left to rot, right? Mm-hmm. And when life circumstances change later on, and all of a sudden now you're seeing, you know what, it would be useful for me to like open up that one room and turn it into my office or whatever. When you go open the door and look in that room, it's going to be bad because you've ignored it for a long time. And that scares people off, especially when we're talking about this, paying attention to your body and how you're feeling, because they start paying attention to it more and they're like, oh, this is terrible. I'm in pain all the time. I'm exhausted all the time. I don't want and they'll think that means that it's not working. Instead of like, that's what's supposed to happen. You are now noticing things that you were just ignoring before. They think the more I pay attention to this stuff, the worse I feel, which is true. And so then they back away from it and say, no, never mind. It's got to be something else. It's got to be psychological or something else. But no, it's going to be bad when you first start paying attention to it. First of all, there's a problem already, or you wouldn't be starting to pay attention to it in the first place. Something has to happen that makes you go, okay, I guess it's worth trying to figure this out. So it's already gotten bad enough to cause problems that are bad enough that you are considering looking into information that you have been ignoring for a long time, which means you've tried to explore all the ways that you've been looking at things generally and failing over and over until you're finally at the point of like, okay, maybe I should start thinking about like how much water I drink during the day. It's going to be bad. Mm-hmm. And so it is a crap process. It sucks. You start feeling more tired and more pain and more thirst. You're going to be like, I'm parched and also need to pee really badly at the exact same time. How the hell does that work? But I can tell you that's how it works. And it does get better over time as you get used to it and you start responding to that information and addressing the problems, but also just kind of building up a schema so that you can see like, oh, that's what that is. And that's what, like you get more used to it, but it takes a long time.
Yeah.
It's not enjoyable.
I think this must be a common experience for people dealing with chronic illness or burnout.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think a lot of when people become aware of chronic illness or burnout is this process of like something has been going unaddressed. And now it's gotten to the point where it's causing problems so large that you can't ignore it and you can't solve it in any other way until you finally have to look at, in the case of burnout, like your energy levels, or in the case of chronic illness, your physical, medical state of being. That it's been years of you just saying, oh, I'm just tired because I'm lazy or I don't feel like doing that, until finally it's so bad that you're like, no, this has to be something happening in my body. And yeah, a lot of chronic illness, a lot of chronic conditions are things that develop that way over time, that a system which has just been malnourished and damaged and overused and not allowed to repair for decades, it gets messed up a little bit. Which is not to say, certainly not all chronic illness is this, and I don't want to imply that like people who are struggling with chronic illness did that to themselves. That's not all what I'm trying to say. It's just the whole point of becoming aware of it as a chronic illness is that once you become aware of it, there are theoretically things that can be done to ameliorate the problem. Not necessarily cure it or eliminate it, but at least make it better. If nothing else, like being more aware of your energy levels when you have chronic fatigue syndrome allows you to plan differently about how to work around it. Yeah. So theoretically, yes, it would have been helpful to you to be aware of it earlier than you became aware of it. But that doesn't mean that you caused the problem.
Yeah, that's a really important thing for people to remember. Yeah.
Depending on the illness or whatever, I mean, some of these things, there is no behavioral or whatever thing that could have theoretically done anything different. And there are some that are like, oh yeah, no, this is, had your whatever pattern been different, this might never have happened. And there's a whole range in between. It's not super worth thinking about that, like how did it come to be? The thing that we're thinking about is, well, what do I do now?
Yeah. Yeah. It can be easy to get stuck in the why me stage of it.
Which is totally fine. There's nothing,
Yeah.
nobody's doing anything wrong thinking or feeling that, but it's not super useful to that person.
No.
It's not pleasant or useful. It doesn't mean they shouldn't do it or that they should rush to like feel bad about doing it.
Yeah. Yeah, you got to feel your feelings about it before you can take the next steps.
Well,
Um,
honestly, what?
oh, I was just going to say we have some comments from Fritz. Hello. It
Hello.
seems that introspection improves as we age, even if only because our other senses have been talking to us for a longer period of time. And I think this is going back to when you're like going to the bathroom or whatever. If a 4-year-old tugs at your sleeves long enough, we stop ignoring.
Yeah, there's a, well, first, just to clarify, because I think there might have been an autocorrect or whatever in that message. We're talking about interoception, which
Oh,
does
yeah.
introspection, but they're different because introspection is a cognitive activity. You're like looking inward and thinking about yourself. Interoception is an actual physical sensation. You know, you have nerve endings on your bladder and on your stomach. There are nerves inside of your body that detect physical stimuli the same way that your ears detect auditory stimuli. So interoception is a physical sense, like hearing or sight or whatever. What you think about the things, how much you notice that, you just like, you know, there are sounds hitting your ears at all times that you theoretically could notice, but are not. At any point, if I say, pay more attention to what you're hearing in our modern world, you know, with HVAC and whatever, like there's always stuff that is, you're getting the physical sense data hitting your ear, but are not actually actively noticing it or perceiving it. Same with interoceptive data. Like when we're potty training kids and we say, check in with your body, there is an actual sense there of like, let me see what it feels like. Right? But introspection is also very important and valuable. And I agree, both of these things become more important as you get older. It's not better. With sensory issues, generally speaking, it's never that a person's ability to sense something is better or worse, except in cases of pathology, right? That obviously there are people who are deaf or hard of hearing, there are people who are blind, or you know, there are instances in which there is some physical thing going on which reduces your ability to access the data. But for the most part, if you know, most people, the apparatus which detects auditory data for me and yours are pretty similar, and there are little minor differences. The shape of our ears, right? Like, and theoretically, those minor differences do make a difference because it's every moment of your life, right? Like over time, somebody whose ears are shaped in such a way that they catch more high-pitched sound waves coming in than I would, are going to develop a different relationship to high-pitched sounds than I will. So, but within a very small window, the actual sensory organs, minus pathological, you know, injuries and illnesses, are more or less the same, right?
Yeah.
Like there aren't humans out there that can see ultraviolet light with their naked eye, right? Like there might be little shifts, but we're all within a very narrow range. So when we're talking about noticing something more or less, we're talking about perception, not sensation. The data that's coming to your sensory organ and being picked up and translated is roughly the same. But how your attentional processes prioritize that data to say this is worth noticing can be vastly different. So that's why I'm trying to shy away from things like better or worse interoception. The data
Yeah.
is there. It's just about whether or not it has been deemed worth paying attention to over all the other things that you're paying attention to instead. But yeah, as you get older, and a large part of that, it's not just the length of time that the 4-year-old has been tugging at your sleeve in this metaphor. It's that the tugging on the sleeve eventually turns into tugging on the arm, eventually turns into like punching you. You know, like it will get to a point that no one can deprioritize like another sensation called nociception is the sensation of pain. Pain is not a signal which exists in like the external universe. It's as we have pain receptors that generate a signal the same way that other senses do. You can ignore little pains. The smallest pains you would have a hard time even noticing when you try, but they're there and you can get them. But eventually when it's painful enough, nobody can overlook that. Doesn't matter what other data is in your face that your attentional processes might be saying, well, this is more important. Eventually it gets big enough that no, it's the most important thing and you notice it. So yeah, as you age. And this is not like, you know, this isn't pop culture. People talk about like, oh man, when I was young, I could eat anything I wanted and sleep whenever I felt like and drink and whatever, and it never caused me a problem, which isn't true for the most part. I think the people who you ask that to, if you say like you were never hungover, like, no, you were sometimes. But you recovered from it a lot faster than you do now. And you could drink a lot more then before getting hungover than you can drink now. And you could push through being hungover and still do stuff better then than you can now.
Yeah.
So yes, this idea that like when I was young, I didn't pay it, or youth is wasted on the young is another, this is everywhere. They're like, we take our bodies for granted when we're young because for the most part, they're pretty resilient. And we're focused on learning and intellect and information and psychology. Like, and then as you get older, it's like, okay, I know a lot of stuff, but knowing all that stuff isn't stopping the fact that my back hurts all the time. So.
Yeah. Sorry, yeah, interrupted.
No, please.
I had a point, but it just slipped away from me.
Yeah.
That happens a lot more as you get older too.
Actually, that's another one that's kind of important, I think, to me. And again, this is Brandon theorizing, not like I have data and whatever that I am, you know, building my theories off of, but I don't want to like claim that this is something that is known. The older that a person gets, the more that they start to worry about dementia or Alzheimer's, memory loss. And so it states the reason that means that any instance of you forgetting or having a hard time finding a word or whatever becomes more meaningful data the older you get. When you're younger and you can't remember a word, it's like, oh, whatever. When you're older and you can't remember a word, then it turns into, oh no, am I losing it? Is that a sign of decline? And whenever a particular type of data is considered to be more valuable, you will notice it a larger proportion of the time that it happens. So I'm not saying that it's happening exactly the same to you as it was when you were 20. It might be happening, but we can pretty confidently theorize that whatever percentage of the times that it happened to you when you were 20 that you noticed and remembered was pretty small. And the percentage of times that it happens now and you notice and remember it is a larger proportion. So it could be happening more frequently and you're noticing and remembering a larger portion of it, but maybe not.
Yeah, maybe I'm just overthinking it.
And this is one of those things that the more you worry about it, the more you worry about, I'm not talking about you specifically, but
yeah,
even my parents who are pretty young for the 38-year-old parents to be, they're in their 60s, are starting to worry about it more. And it is like the more you worry about it, the more you'll notice anything that you think. Like last Thursday, all day long, in my head it was Friday. We all have that experience, right? Where it's like, for whatever reason, you're confident that tomorrow is Saturday. And then, I don't know, a dozen different times throughout the day, I was made aware or remembered like, oh, wait, no, tomorrow's Friday. Still kept slipping back into it. And if I was worried about dementia, if I was worried that I'm losing it as I get older, then I'd be like, oh no, what's wrong with me, right? And maybe I will when I worry about that stuff more than I'm currently worrying about it. but it is one of those. It's one of those things that will get worse the more you think about it. Like intrusive thoughts. The more meaningful that you think an intrusive thought is, the more frequently you're going to think it, the more difficulty you're going to have in moving on. That maybe it's easiest just to say that worrying that you're losing it or that you're is just a version of an intrusive thought. It is an intrusive thought.
Yeah, that's true. Is there some overlap then between, you mentioned passive suicidal ideation earlier and intrusive thoughts?
Sure. Intrusive thoughts it's one of those phrases that people use it to mean a lot of different things.
Yeah.
But clinically, when we're talking about intrusive thoughts, we're talking about more like the longer term would be ego-dystonic intrusive thoughts.
Ooh, what does that mean?
Ego-dystonic means I don't like that I'm thinking this. Ego meaning like self, and dystonic meaning bad feeling, like dysphoria or whatever. I don't like it. It doesn't feel, like, for example, if a person has a thought of, well, let's use the kind of more concerning example that we've already brought up. If a person has a thought of like, I wish that I did not live anymore. I wish I didn't wake up tomorrow. And then responds to that thought by thinking, oh no, does that mean that I want to kill myself? Right? Mm-hmm. Like, if your response to the thought is, oh no, does that mean I want to kill myself? Then the answer to the question is, no, you don't want to kill yourself because you don't like that you're having the thought, right? Like, if you're viewing that thought as a sign that you are more likely to commit suicide and your response to that is to say, oh no, then by definition, that means that you don't want to commit suicide. You're worried about the eventuality of it happening. Are you more likely to? Maybe. I mean, that's, if things keep going in that direction, maybe it's a like pain, a warning signal to get you to address something. But if your response to a thought is, oh no, does that mean X? Then the answer is always, no, it doesn't mean that. Because otherwise you wouldn't respond to it by saying, oh no.
Oh no, yeah.
In terms of wanting something. Right? So that ego-dystonic, that's what that means. It's like, no, I don't like whatever that thought was. I don't like it. It doesn't feel like me. That's not what I want. I'm worried about the fact that I have that thought.
Okay.
And then intrusive thought, one of the reasons that phrase gets used for so many different things is because by the wording of it, what it means is a thought which comes to you unbidden, right? Like a thought just pops into your head, which is totally fair. And it gets used for a lot of different things because all thoughts work that way.
Yeah.
Like, go ahead and create a thought in your head. You don't, you observe them. And theoretically, there are processes that create them. And when you're thinking about like, oh, if I think A, B, C, then the next thought is D, we can track our logic as we develop things, whatever. But that's why ego-dystonic intrusive thoughts is what we tend to focus on more. Is hard to say exactly what a thought coming to mind unbidden really means. But we can much more easily identify, I keep thinking this thought even though I don't like it. And there are reasons for intrusive thoughts, even ego-dystonic ones. And they don't mean, this is part of the reason I'm on such a campaign to abolish everybody's idea of the subconscious, because that's where ego-dystonic intrusive thoughts really freak people out, is that they think it means that they subconsciously want something that they consciously don't want.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
But if you get rid of the idea of subconscious desire, I was driving up to Michigan with my whole family in the van, and we drove across a big bridge over a river. The image popped into my mind of swerving off the side of the road and like all of us plummeting to our doom, and the 2.5 seconds I would have to be filled with utter regret and terror that happened. And I felt that. And of course, the entire time I'm still driving straight. Like, that's not swerving. I have no desire to. The thought of it made me very sad and scared in that moment. Not the thought that I might want to, but just the thought of like, what would that be like? I think a useful phrase here is the brain's job is not to keep you happy, it's to keep you alive.
Yeah.
One of the things that it does, especially in times when there's not a lot calling your attention, not a lot that's demanding your working memory space, is it just starts to like run random scenarios and be like, well, what if this happened? What if that happened? What if we swerved off that? Oh no, that would be bad, right? And it's just that quick, and it happens to you all the time. You walk down the grocery aisle, you have a thought about just knocking over the display, like we have these thoughts. And then the response to it generally is, yeah, I don't want to do that, so I'm not going to, right? That's the process is, what if this? Oh, well, that would lead to things that I wouldn't like, so don't do that. And it's only when you make the mistake of thinking that means you secretly want the thing,
Mm-hmm.
then all of a sudden it causes distress. Oh no, why do I want to destroy this grocery aisle display?
I'm thinking of there's a British comedian, Robin Ince, who identifies as neurodivergent. I think he's ADHD. And he has a piece about this in a show he did last year or the year before, where he talks about somebody lets you hold their baby and your first thought is, I'm going to punt this baby. I'm just going to send this baby flying. And then you panic that you'll be the worst possible person to be in charge of a child. And he says, because you're thinking those thoughts, that probably means you're the safest person for that baby to be around.
Something, I think we said it recently, but it bears repeating. And if we haven't said it, it's definitely worth saying. Especially for neurodivergent people to know this. The more afraid you are of something, the less likely it is that that thing will happen.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean you're crazy or irrational, which is how especially people who identify as neurodivergent will respond to it. Like, I'm so afraid that so-and-so will leave me, even though I know they won't. What's wrong with me? Why do I keep thinking these things? Well, so-and-so isn't leaving, at least in part because of the state of your relationship and how you interact with one another and whatever. Now, is it necessary or required that you be afraid of them leaving in order for that relationship to be maintained? No. At least theoretically, no. But the more afraid of it you are, the more likely you are to be doing all the things that prevent it from happening. So it's completely rational and logical to expect that the thing a person is most afraid of is the thing that is least likely to happen. People who identify as neurodivergent have this tendency to think that our thoughts should accurately reflect reality, and it gets us into a lot of trouble. Like the intrusive thought thing. If I think about swerving, that must mean that I want to. No, it doesn't. Your thoughts, if I'm afraid of this thing, that has to mean that it's likely to happen. Otherwise, my fear is irrational and I'm just being anxious and paranoid. No, that's not what fear is for humans, right? Like, that's like saying that if something hurts you, it shouldn't hurt you, because once it hurts you, you address it and then it's no longer a problem. Hadn't hurt you, you wouldn't have addressed it. It would have continued to be a problem. Because again, it's another version of thinking that if you just think about things in the right way, then you can solve every problem.
Yeah. And we've talked about it quite a bit now, that you can't think your way out of every problem.
Right. And there are upsides and downsides. That's the point of neurodiversity. That's why I push back so hard against people who divide it into neurodivergent versus neurotypical.
Neurotypical, yeah.
The point of neurodiversity is that any variation which is not pathological has its upsides and its downsides. It must be situationally advantageous and disadvantageous. Being somebody who thinks a lot has a lot of advantages. It makes you very well suited to some things. It has a lot of disadvantages too. Being somebody who doesn't think a lot has a lot of disadvantages, has a lot of advantages too. Most of those things are in direct opposition to one another. Just like the disadvantages of being tall, the things that you're poorly suited to when you're tall are things that short people are probably well suited to, and vice versa. That's why there's a normal distribution, and in any given trait, most people fall right in the middle with fewer and fewer examples further out to the extreme, and extremes in both directions balance out. So yeah, there's some downsides to thinking a lot. There's some upsides to it too.
Yeah.
And every single person who identifies as neurodivergent has experienced a lot of success in their life by thinking. That doesn't mean academically they got good grades, although that is frequent. There's a reason there's a huge overlap between late identified neurodivergent and former gifted kid kinds of people. But people don't do things that don't work for them consistently. If you try something and it doesn't work and it causes you a problem, you give it up pretty quick.
Mm-hmm.
The things that cause you problems long term are the things that when you do it, it works 95 times out of 100. And that makes it so that even though 1 out of 20 times is causing you a problem, it's still something that's worth doing over and over, and you can't always identify when it's going to be that time. So if you're somebody who overthinks things or ruminates, then logically speaking, thinking about things helps you like way more often than it doesn't. The problem is this is about frequency,
Mm-hmm.
not volume, right? That if you solve 100 problems by thinking about them, each of those takes a second, and then one that you get stuck on and don't solve, you're going to think about for 3 days. So your experience might still be that like, I spent so much time dealing with the difficulties associated with thinking about things, but most of the time it still works for you. Like again, you wouldn't identify yourself as neurodivergent if you didn't have reason to believe in your life that new ideas, new concepts, new language that you can use to think about yourself, but also communicate with other people about yourself are useful things. If you didn't have reason to think that, why would you go looking for a new concept with a new piece of language on top of it? Just kind of like if you've never been to the doctor or had any medical intervention help solve any problem for you, then no matter what problem you're experiencing, you're not going to think, oh, this is probably a medical thing. Why would you jump to that? Unless it's been proven to you that that's helpful sometimes. So anyway. So yes, intrusive thoughts and passive suicidal ideation are very related because passive suicidal ideation is a version of ego-dystonic intrusive thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
If a person actually consciously wants to kill themselves, then they don't tell other people about it. If your response is concern, then it's not what you want. And I would like to think, although I can't say that this is true by any means, I would like to think that before people get to the point of actively wanting that there's probably a lot of build up to that, right? That there's a lot of time before that things can be addressed. And I don't think that's always true, especially when it comes to things like chronic pain and things like that. But certainly when we're talking about emotional, or mental, psychological concerns, I would like to hope that everyone goes through a process of things getting worse and worse and worse and worse and worse before it actually gets to that point. Because yeah, if that's actually what you're intending to do, no one can stop you because you just don't tell them.
Yeah.
So if your response is concern and talking, then it's an intrusive thought. And yes, intrusive thoughts will happen more the more tired you are, for a lot of reasons. One of which is that the more tired you are, like we started off with, the more tired you are, the more likely it is that when something happens that is angering or saddening or anxiety inducing, that you notice it, you respond to it in that way, and you have a hard time moving off of that onto something else. So even if the intrusive thoughts happen at the same rate, when you're tired, you're more likely to respond to like, oh no, and then get stuck on that.
So can we talk about potential intervention design then for somebody who is feeling really low, who maybe isn't in touch with what they're feeling physically, and who might benefit from getting more in touch with whether they're hungry or thirsty or need a nap or whatever, in order to boost their mood?
Well, there's prevention and there's coping. And depending on where a person is, the worse off someone is, the worse things are, the more likely it is that we want to start with coping, which means when it happens, how do you respond to it at that point so that it isn't as bad, as it would be before you start doing these coping things.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, we want to get to the point where we're doing things that prevent it so that it's just not happening as much. I don't think there's ever really anything in the realm that we're talking about that can be made to never happen at all.
Yeah.
It can happen less frequently and be less intense, or likely to be less intense, or have a lower duration when it does happen. And when it comes to coping, mostly what we would be talking about is stuff that falls under the category of regulation, right? Anything that you think of as helping to regulate you is something that helps to cope with negative emotional experiences. That's what we mean by it. So stimming, which again, like we talked about last week, everybody does, even if everybody doesn't call it that. There are reasons that doing physical things draw your attention away from the internal environment. But also, you can't make yourself think anything. You can't make yourself feel anything. You can, in a very, very limited fashion, make yourself do things.
Yeah.
That's the only thing that we have any ability to like make it happen. And that is very limited. So when you're thinking, when you're in a bad place and even thinking like doing, because a default recommendation would be do something you enjoy, watch a show that you like, talk to a friend, play a game, which is great advice and is much more useful the earlier on you use it, right? The more likely you are to be able to do it. But eventually it gets to a point where it's bad enough that you're like, well, I could do this thing, but I don't even like, why even bother? I won't like it. It won't work. I'll do it for like 10 minutes and I'll get bored and I'll stop. Which is a version of trying to solve the problem intellectually, right? Like by thinking. If I think enough about all the potential things I could do, certainly something will occur to me and then I'll feel better. So something I would recommend, this is like when it gets the worst it can get before the point that you lose all ability to do it on your own. And you just need to rely on other people or time passing or context shifting without you doing it, is to put yourself in the context in which you are more likely to respond to it by feeling or thinking or doing the things that you wish you were. So in other words, if you're wanting to be happier and more excited than you are, and you think, for example, well, I could play a video game that helps me sometimes, and your response to that is, that won't work. And that's happening, do it anyway. Go sit down on the couch, put the controller in your hand, make yourself just open up a game. And a lot of the time you'll find that once you do that part, like the next thing happens and the next thing, you just start automatically responding to it. And it does end up catching your attention or interest or, taking some of your mind off of what you're thinking about. Like one of the, I think, best general hacks for ADHD would be anyone who is struggling to get themselves to do something that they want to be doing or think would be valuable or important to do is put yourself in the environment in which you would do the thing, or put the tool that you use to do the thing in your hand, right? If you want to be cooking, put a spatula in your hand. And before you know it, sometimes you've just started cooking. But that's when it's like as bad as it can get before the cutoff point that there's nothing you're not even going to even recognize what's going on with you, much less come up with an idea, much less be able to execute it.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of the day, we're humans and we're relying on other humans. You cannot always solve your own problems. That's the point of relationships. That's the point of structuring your life in such a way that other people check in on you, even when you are in a place that you can't check in on that. And if that's not happening in your life, then things are pretty bad, and we want to work on changing that. But making it so that your emotional, like if you're having some negative, unenjoyable, unuseful emotional experience, making it less intense and last less long is always some version of draw your attention to other things. Either physically by doing stimming or meditation or yoga or going outside. A large part of why going outside and taking a walk will help is because you have to physically move your body. You have to pay attention to the environment around you enough to be able to physically navigate it as you're walking without tripping and bumping into things. And there's a ton of novel data. All right, here's a Brandon theory that I'm, again, sure other people also have. being in buildings all the time is wonderful. Like temperature controlled environment, like don't have to worry about the weather, have electric lights so that I can see things when I feel like it. Being inside a building is awesome. And part of why it's awesome is because it puts bounds on those processes which dictate what things are worth noticing and what isn't. One of the things that seems to correlate is sounds that originate from outside of my building are sounds that I don't really need to pay attention to, right? Things that are outside of the window are not things that are going to interfere with what I'm doing and therefore don't require my attention. In either of those cases, I can direct my attention in that way and look out the window or listen for things that are out there. But as a general moment-to-moment process, but as soon as you step outside, those bounds are gone. If your attentional process, which I think all of us do, theories, right, have this kind of rule of things that are originating outside of the building that I am in are not that important unless they're really intense and extreme. You know, a car screeching right up to the window, I'll notice, but traffic driving by, I won't. As soon as you step outside, that rule doesn't apply anymore. And now it's like sounds that originate 50 yards away or 300 yards away are both still theoretically relevant to me. Mm-hmm. Literally, you will see farther because things which are farther away could impact you. So just drawing your attention away in any way to the environment or to something that's enjoyable. That, you know, if you're thinking about things, if it's to something that's cognitive, something you enjoy. The problem with all of that is the number one thing that universally draws people's attention are negative things, harmful or potentially harmful things. So if what your internal emotional experience is a big problem, it's painful, it's indicative of something that could be a really big problem, it's very difficult to draw your attention to anything else unless the other thing you're drawing attention to is even bigger problem, which is not a solution, right? Like that just makes things worse because now you've got a bigger, you know, like I don't care how like ruminating you are about whether that person ghosted you because of whatever you said or whatever. I don't care how into it you are. And I can get pretty into that stuff to the point where like the external world's decent to it. How into it you are. If you light your bed on fire while you're sitting in it, you will very quickly stop thinking about that. Because you will be thinking about the fact that your bed is on fire when you're in it. So you can always get it away by making a bigger problem for yourself. And a lot of the time when people talk about unhealthy coping mechanisms and whatever, that's what we're talking about is a pattern of creating a bigger problem to draw my attention away from the thing. It's not okay. Great. So yes, it is tricky to be able to draw your attention. And this is, to me, kind of looking back around, where sensitivity comes in. If you are hypersensitive to a certain type of data, whether that's, we're talking auditory or visual or whatever, you can divide data up in a kind of a way. I can say I am hypersensitive to data related to Dungeons and Dragons. If I'm walking down the street in the city of Chicago and there's a bunch of posters all over the walls, that's just background noise and I don't notice it. But if one of those posters has a big D20 on it, then I'm going to notice it. So we're talking about interests and hobbies and whatever. You're hypersensitive to the information about that stuff. So expose yourself to that stuff. Put yourself in a situation in which you are more likely to be exposed to that type of data and rely on your hypersensitivity to make sure that you notice it, even though it isn't a bigger problem or doesn't seem like a bigger problem than whatever's going on inside. So yes, playing games, talking to people, engaging in your art, you know, like lots of hobbies and activities, but also fairly universal one is be around somebody.
Yeah.
Like if another person is in the room talking to you, for the most part, like overwhelmingly, that will draw your attention from anything that's internal, because other people communicating to us is one of those things that is very high priority pretty much across the board. Even those of you who are thinking, but I have social anxiety and I'm not good at communicating and I'm an introvert. All those things are true, at least in part, because of how much your attention is drawn to other people trying to communicate with you. That's why it's exhausting or anxiety inducing, is because it is so important to you to pay attention to what someone else is saying, that it draws. A lot of it is like, if I pay attention, if I look at them while they're talking, I'll forget what I'm going to say next, right? But in this case, what we're talking about is you want to forget what's in your head. So have someone else talk to you. There's a reason that therapy, even regardless of approach and technique and theory, obviously I care a lot about those things, but just going and talking to somebody is in and of itself a baseline of help, depending on the problem. We have a lot of clients that will end up coming here with like, my last therapist, or, honestly, most of the clients that come to us have seen many therapists previously. And they will often say something like, these other therapists I used to see, they're really nice, they're lovely, and they were able to help me to an extent, but they would just kind of sit and listen and validate me and never really like help me figure out what to do or change or whatever. And that's because, the act of just having somebody to talk to helps with what we would call around here second order issues. You're angry, and then you feel angry about the fact that you're angry. If you're sad, and then you feel sad about the fact that you are sad. Just having somebody else to talk to and listen to you and say, wow, yeah, helps with that second thing. You're now less sad about the fact that you're sad. But it doesn't help with the first thing. That's when you need to like actually come up with ideas and whatever to move forward. Okay. People will see therapists and get that first kind of help where it just helps decrease the intensity and helps cope, but then they want to move on to prevention, and the therapist, a lot of them don't have something there. So intervention-wise, coping is all some version of draw your attention away from what's happening internally, rely on hypersensitivities, look at your patterns of what is the information. Like, I'll be in the grocery store and the music will be playing and I don't notice it, but then if this kind of music plays, I notice it. That's a hypersensitivity in terms of what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. I know we're running over time, we gotta get going here, but quickly on prevention, especially for those of us who identify as neurodivergent, like we said, by definition means that you are a person who relies on language and concepts in order to try and understand and respond to problems. The generic, overwhelming thing is start assigning language, whatever thing it is that you're trying to notice more. The prevention is going to be about, there's something I haven't been noticing, some warning signal I've been missing, or some opportunities that I've been missing. It's always going to start with some version of there's something I haven't been paying enough attention to that I want to pay more attention to. You start by assigning language to that stuff. There's something called the Bader-Meinhof effect, which is the phenomenon of you learn a word or a phrase for something, and then all of a sudden you notice it everywhere.
Okay.
I say to you right now, did you know that a group of crows is called a murder? For anybody who already knew that, nothing changes. But for anyone who didn't already know that and does hear me and it is like internalized and that it's added to their internal kind of set of symbols, every time they see a group of crows now, they're going to say, ooh, that's a murder. Ooh, that's a murder. They're going to tell people about it. And then a week later, they're going to be like, I just learned the word murder of crows last week, and I've seen 8 murders of crows, and I never see crows. Which what was happening is most likely you were seeing them at the same rate, but without the language, your attentional processes don't prioritize it. If it's important, have language for it. Notice how as soon as you start thinking about neurodiversity or ADHD, the moment someone's like, I have ADHD, then very frequently the next step is they start seeing it in everything. So, my ADHD, well, that's my ADHD. I've literally had a person at one point in a consult say that they think of themselves as being a bad sex partner, and they say their ADHD makes them bad at sex. That was like an actual phrase that somebody said, which is understandable when you follow the logic. Like, it's hard for me to focus and be present. You get into the word, you start to see it everywhere. And it's only over time as you use it that you start to suss out like when it's useful and when it's not. So new language will make you notice this stuff. And by far the most common generic default version of this is what we call scaling. That you create a scale. So in terms of like kinds of things we're talking about that have to do with burnout or exhaustion or depletion or whatever. If you're wanting to notice your level of tiredness or whatever more, then create a scale, 0 to 100, 100 being the most energized you've ever felt. And everybody says, what if you've never been 100? And I say, I just said it's the most energized you've ever felt. So you have been 100. It was whatever the best you ever felt was. And if tomorrow you feel more energized than you've ever felt before, then that would be the new 100. It's a shifting scale. But as a general rule, always put the thing that you want more of to be the higher number, because we have associations with high numbers and low numbers. And in cases where people are saying, but I want to be able to describe that some negative thing is more intense, then great, just use negative numbers, right? That 10 is I'm as happy as I can be, negative 10 is I'm as sad as I can be, and 0 is baseline where I'm not particularly happy or sad. So use numbers. People often want to use other things, and that's fine. The only problem is then you have to create new language or symbols for every rank. Like someone will say, I think of it more in colors, which is great, but doesn't look super well for what we're talking about, because if you're like, my energy level feels like greenish blue right now, and then the next day you're like, and now my energy feels like orange, is that more or less than it was before? And if there's more, and then the next day you feel red, and that's more than greenish bluish, but less than orange, it's a lot harder to track. It can work, it's just a lot more costly to do it that way. So identify whatever it is you're wanting to pay more attention to, learn some new language or create some new language for yourself around it, attach it to a scale, and then just try and prompt yourself to remember to check in on it as much as possible. If you start doing 0 to 100 energy level, you check in on it and say, where am I at right now? 70. Where am I at right now? 32. Automatically, you will start making connections about what things drain your energy more than others, what things restore your energy more than others, what things, when you do it before going to bed one night, make it so that you wake up with a better or worse energy the next month. Observation first. Generally, again, people who identify as neurodivergent, you don't need a lot of help in learning how to solve problems. You just need more information. If you get a little bit more information, then you go back to what you're good at and saying, well, I've got this new data, let me plug that in now. And you come up with all kinds of stuff. And I try to avoid too specific recommendations because I don't want to constrain what people are looking at. Pay attention to what you're feeling, how you're feeling, what levels you're at, and you will come up with better solutions for yourself than I could. If we were meeting one-on-one, I'd be able to do a lot more.
Yeah. All right. We're definitely over time. There's a final comment from Fritz. Speaking of language development, I never sussed before until the oracle used the word.
I'm not sure who he's referring to by the oracle, but he might be referring to my oldest son. For the funny things, and I love you, Dad. That's a misuse of the word sus. Sus is short for suspicious. It's like slang. So when you say like that guy's sus, it means like that guy's suspicious. Oh, I'm the oracle.
You're the oracle.
Yeah, no, but some other time, let's talk about oracles in like mythology from different times, like different cultures around the world. There's interesting stuff there involving snakes and spears and rocks and holy places. There's like certain patterns that pop.
Oh yes, please. Yeah. For that. Yeah, you too. I guess we won't be back next week. Next Monday is Christmas Day. Happy holidays, everybody. And the Monday after is New Year's Day. So I don't know if you want to check back in.
I'll be here next week, and I'm kind of up in the air about New Year's Day right now. I don't know. You and I can talk about it offline. I'll get a sense of where you and Caitlin are at.
Okay. Sounds good.
We will not be here next week. We may or may not be here on the 1st.
We'll let you know in all the usual places.
Yeah.
All right. Take care. Happy holidays.
Happy New Year to everybody, and any holidays you celebrate. It's just generally transition through the year, the beginning of the new year. It's a big time. I hope it's enjoyable and meaningful for everyone.
Take care.
Bye.